talk about doing the Trojan War. It's a very popular, mystery. The Trojan War was a legendary conflict in Greek mythology that took place around the 12th or 13th century BC. And if you're gonna get ready to tune in, make sure to leave a comment, hit the like and subscribe button if you're tuning in. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel, Rusty the King, and let me know what you guys' thoughts are on the Greek mythology and the Trojan War, which is what we're talking about. So the war was waged by the Achaeans, which was the Greeks, against the city of Troy after Paris of Troy took Helen from her husband Menelaus, who was the king of Sparta. Now, the war is one of the most important events in Greek mythology, and it has been narrated through many works of Greek literature, especially in Homer's Iliad, which I do have the Homer's Iliad book somewhere in my room. The core of the Iliad, books 2 through 13, or 23 actually, it describes a period of 4 days and 2 nights in the 10th year of the decade-long siege of Troy. The Odyssey describes the journey home of Odysseus, one of the war's heroes. Other parts of the war are described in a cycle of epic poems which have survived through fragments, and episodes from the war provided material for Greek tragedy and other works of Greek literature, and for Roman poets including Virgil and Ovid. Now, the ancient Greeks believed that Troy was located near the Dardanelles, and that the Trojan War was a historical event of the 12th or 13th century BC. By the mid-19th century AD, both the war and the city were widely seen as non-historical, but in 1868, the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann met Frank Calvert, who convinced Schliemann that Troy was at what is now in modern-day Turkey. On the basis of excavations conducted by Schliemann and others, this claim is now accepted by most scholars. The historicity of the Trojan War remains an open question. Now, many scholars believe that there is a historical core to the tale, though that this may simply mean that the Homeric stories are a fusion of various tales of sieges and expeditions by the Messenian Greeks during the Bronze Age. I do want to do a video on the Bronze Age too. Hello, baby boss, for tuning in. Now those who believe that the stories of the Trojan War are derived from a specific historical conflict usually date to the 12th or 11th century BC, often preferring the dates given by, now I'm not sure if I'm going to say this name right, but Eratosthenes, which dated between 1194 and 1184 BC. Now, which roughly corresponds to archaeological evidence of a catastrophic burning of Troy the Seventh and the late Bronze Age collapse. I'm not a history professor, but I wish I could be one. Now, the events of the Trojan War are found in many works of Greek literature and depicted in numerous works of Greek art and movies. Now, there is no single authoritative text which tells the entire events of the war, but instead, the story is assembled from a variety of sources, some of which report contradictory versions of the events. Now, the most important literary sources are the 2 epic poems traditionally credited to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it's composed sometime between the 9th and 6th century BC. Each poem narrates only a part of the war, but the Iliad covers a short period in the last year of the siege of Troy, while the Odyssey concerns Odysseus' return to his home island of Ithaca following the sacking of Troy, and contains several flashbacks to particular episodes in that war. Now, other parts of the Trojan War were told in the poems of the epic cycle, also known as the cyclic epics, the Cyphria, Aethiopus, Little Iliad, Persis, Nosto, and Telegani. Now, though these poems survive only in fragments, their content is known from a summary included in Proclus Chrestomathy. Now, the authorship of the cyclic epics is uncertain because nobody knows who wrote it. It is generally thought that the poems were written down in the 7th and 6th century BC after the composition of the Homeric poems, though it is widely believed that they were based on earlier tradition. Now, both the Homeric epics and the epic cycle take origin from oral tradition. Now, even after the composition of the Iliad, Odyssey, and the cyclic epics, the myths of the Trojan War were passed on orally in many genres of poetry and through non-poetic storytelling. The events and details of the story that are only found in later authors may have been passed on through oral tradition. Could be as old as the Homeric poems. The visual arts such as vase painting was another medium in which myths of the Trojan War circulated around. In later ages, playwrights, historians, and other intellectuals would create works inspired by the Trojan War. The three great tragedy people of Athens, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, wrote a number of dramas that portray episodes from the Trojan War. Among the Roman writers, the most important is the 1st century BC poet Virgil. In Book 2 of his Aeneid, Aeneas narrates the sack of Troy. And you can see some of these photos here. You can see this right here, which is the Golden Apple of Discord by Jacob Jordians. Now, traditionally, the Trojan War arose from a sequence of events beginning with a quarrel between the goddess Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Now, Eris, the goddess of discord, was not invited to the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, and so arrived bearing a gift, a golden apple inscribed for the fairest. Now, each of the goddesses claimed to be the fairest and the rightful owner of the apple. They submitted the judgment to a shepherd that they encountered tending to his flock. Now, each of the goddesses promised the young man a boon in return for his favor, power, wisdom, or love. The youth, in fact, Paris, a Trojan prince who had been raised in the countryside, chose love and awarded the apple to Aphrodite. As his reward, Aphrodite gave him Helen, the queen of Sparta, and who was considered to be the most beautiful woman of the time, to fall in love with Paris. Now, the judgment of Paris earned him the ire of both Hera and Athena. And when Helen left her husband, Menelaus, the Spartan king, for Paris of Troy, Menelaus called upon all the kings and princes of Greece to wage war upon Troy. Menelaus' brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, led an expedition of Achaean troops to Troy and took siege of the city for 10 years because of Paris' insult. Now, after the deaths of many heroes, including the Achaeans, Achilles, and Ajax, and the Trojans, Hector and Paris, the city fell to the ruse of the Trojan horse. The Achaeans slaughtered the Trojans, except for some of the women and children whom they kept or sold as slaves and desecrated the temples, thus earning God's wrath. Now, few of the Achaeans returned safely to their homes, and many founded colonies in distant shores. The Romans later traced their origin to Aeneas, Aphrodite's son, and one of the Trojans, who was said to have led the surviving Trojans to Italy. Now, the following summary of the Trojan War follows the orders of events as given in Proclus' summary, along with the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Aeneid. They're supplemented with details drawn from Now, there actually is this. This is the burning of Troy, when they showed this in the movie, where they burned down Troy. This is a painting from 1759, and you can see the city of Troy burning. They portrayed that in the movie with Brad Pitt, too. Where they did the movie Troy with Brad Pitt, where they were burning the city at the end of the movie. This is Polyxena's sarcophagus. I have to look up Polyxena. This is Polyxena's sarcophagus in the Troy Museum. I'm not sure where the Troy Museum is. I have to look that up. According to Greek mythology, Zeus had become king of the gods by overthrowing his father Cronus, but Cronus, in turn, had overthrown his father Uranus. Zeus was not faithful to his wife and sister Hera, and had many relationships from which many children were born. Since Zeus believed that there were too many people populating the earth, he envisioned Momus or Themis, who was to use the Trojan War as means to depopulate the earth, especially of his demigod descendants. Now this can be supported by Hesiod's account. All the gods were divided through strife. For that very time, Zeus, who thunders on high, was meditating marvelous deeds. Even to mingle storm and tempest over the boundless earth, and already he was hastening to make an utter end of the race of mortal men, declaring that he would destroy the lives of demigods, that the children of the gods should not mate with wretched mortals, seeing their fate with their own eyes, but that the blessed gods henceforth, even as aforetime, should have their living and their habitations apart from men, but on those who were born of immortals and of mankind. Verily Zeus laid toil and sorrow upon sorrow. The judgment of Paris. Zeus came to learn from either Themis or Prometheus after Heracles had released him from the Caucasus that, like his father Cronos, he would be overthrown by one of his sons. Another prophecy stated that a son of the sea nymph Thetis, with whom Zeus fell in love with after gazing upon her in the oceans of the Greek coast, would become greater than his father for one or both of these reasons, either upon Zeus's orders or because she wished to please Hera, who had raised her. Thetis was betrothed to an elderly human king, Peleus, son of Acus. Now all of the gods were invited to Peleus and Thetis' wedding and brought many gifts except Eris, the goddess of discord, who was stopped at the door by Hermes on Zeus's order. Insulted, she threw from the door a gift of her own, a golden apple. The apple was claimed by Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, and they quarreled bitterly over it, and none of the other gods would venture an opinion favoring one, for fear of earning the enmity of the other two. Eventually, Zeus ordered Hermes to lead the three goddesses to Paris. A prince of Troy, who was unaware of his ancestry, was being raised as a shepherd on Mount Ida because of a prophecy that he would be the downfall of Troy. After bathing in the spring of Ida, the goddesses appeared to him naked, either for the sake of winning or at Paris' request. Paris was unable to decide among them, so the goddesses resorted to bribes. Athena offered Paris wisdom, skill in battle, and the abilities of the great warriors. Hera offered him political power and control of all of Asia, and Aphrodite offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, who was Helen, the queen of Sparta. Paris awarded the apple to Aphrodite, and after several adventures, returned to Troy, where he was recognized by his royal family. Now Peleus and Thetis bore a son, who was Achilles. It was foretold that he would either die of old age after an uneventful life, or he would die young in a battlefield and gain immortality through poetry. Now, furthermore, when Achilles was 9 years old, Calchas had prophesied that Troy could not again fall without his help. A number of sources credit Thetis with an attempt to make Achilles immortal when he was an infant. Some of these state that she held him over fire every night to burn away his mortal parts and rubbed him with ambrosia during the day, but Peleus discovered her actions and stopped her. Now, here's a face painting of Thetis giving her son Achilles weapons forged by Hephaestus, and then underneath here, you got musician figures from clay in the Troy Museum. Now, according to some versions of the story, Thetis had already killed several sons in this manner, and Peleus' actions therefore saved his son's life. Other sources state that Thetis bathed Achilles in the Styx, the river that runs to the underworld, making him invulnerable wherever he was touched by the water. Because she had held him by the heel, he was not entirely immersed during the bathing, and thus the heel remained made mortal and vulnerable to injury. Hence the expression Achilles' heel from an isolated weakness. He grew up to be the greatest of all mortal warriors. After Calchas' prophecy, Thetis hid Achilles in Skyros at the court of King Lycomedes, where he was disguised as a girl. But at a crucial point in the war, she assists her son by providing weapons divinely forged by Hephaestus and see below. The elopement of Paris and Helen. Now, the most beautiful woman in the world was considered to be Helen, Queen of Sparta, and one of the daughters of Tyndareus, King of Sparta. Now, her mother was Leda, who had been either raped or seduced by Zeus in the form of a swan, but accounts differ over which of Leda's four children, which two pairs of twins were fathered by Zeus, and which by Tyndareus. Now, however, Helen is usually credited as Zeus's daughter, and sometimes Nemesis is credited as her mother, but Helen had scores of suitors, and her father was unwilling to choose one for fear of the others would retaliate violently. Now, finally, one of the suitors, Odysseus of Ithaca, proposed a plan to solve the dilemma. In exchange for Tyndareus' support of his own suit towards Penelope, he suggested that Tyndareus require all of Helen's suitors to promise that they would defend the marriage of Helen regardless of who she chose, or who he chose, basically. The suitors duly swore the required oath on the severed pieces of a horse, although not without a certain amount of grumbling. Now, Tyndareus chose Menelaus. Menelaus was a political choice on her father's part, because he had wealth and power. He had humbly not petitioned for her himself, but instead sent his brother Agamemnon on his behalf. He had promised Aphrodite a hecatombs, a sacrifice of 100 oxen, if he won Helen, but forgot about it and earned her wrath. Menelaus inherited Tyndareus' throne of Sparta with Helen as his queen when her brothers Castor and Pollux became gods, and when Agamemnon married Helen's sister Clytemnestra and took back the throne of Messene. Now, Paris, under the guise of a supposed diplomatic mission, he went to Sparta to get Helen and bring her back to Troy. Before Helen could look up to see him enter the place, she was shot with an arrow from Eros, otherwise known as Cupid, and fell in love with Paris when she saw him, as promised by Aphrodite. Menelaus had left for Crete to bury his uncle Cratius. Now, according to one account, Hera, who's still jealous over the judgment of Paris, sent a storm. The storm caused the lovers to land in Egypt. Now, where the gods replaced Helen with the likeliness of her made of clouds, Nephili. The myth of Helen being switched is attributed to the 6th century BC Sicilian poet Stesichorus, while for Homer, the Helen and Troy was one and the same. The ship then landed in Sidon. Paris, who was fearful of being caught, spent some time there and then sailed to Troy. Paris' abduction of Helen had several precedents. Lo was taken from Messene. Europa was taken from Phoenicia. Jason took Medea from Colchis, and the Trojan princess Hesione had been taken by Heracles, who gave her to Telamon of Salamis. Now, according to Herodotus, Paris was emboldened by these examples to steal himself away from Greece, and he expected no retribution, since there had been none in the other cases. According to Homer, Menelaus and his ally Odysseus traveled to Troy, where they unsuccessfully sought to recover Helen by diplomatic means. Menelaus then asked Agamemnon to help him enforce the oath of Helen's suitors, which was to defend her marriage, regardless of which suitor was chosen. Agamemnon agreed and sent emissaries to all of the Achaean kings and princes to call them to observe their oath and retrieve Helen. This was right here. Right here, this is Odysseus discovering Achilles dressed as a woman and hiding among the princes at the royal court of Skyros. And this was between the 4th and 5th century BC, or AD. Sorry. Since Menelaus' wedding, Odysseus had married Penelope, and he fathered a son, Telemachus. In order to avoid the war, he feigned madness and sowed his fields with salt. Now, Palamedes outwitted him by placing Telemachus, then an infant, in front of the plow's path. Odysseus turned aside, unwilling to kill his son, so revealing his sanity and forcing him to join the war. Now, according to Homer, however, Odysseus supported the military adventure from the beginning and traveled the region with Pylos' king Nestor to recruit forces. At Skyros, Achilles had an affair with the king's daughter, Didamia. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Now, resulting in a child, Neoptimalus. Now Odysseus, the Telamonian Ajax, and Achilles' suitor Phoenix went to retrieve Achilles. Now Achilles' mother disguised him as a woman so that he would not have to go to war, but according to one story, they blew a horn and Achilles revealed himself by seizing a spear to fight the intruders rather than fleeing. According to another story, they disguised themselves as merchants, bearing trinkets and weaponry, and Achilles was marked out from the other women for admiring weaponry instead of clothes and jewelry, as a woman would honor those two. The Pausanians said that according to Homer, Achilles did not hide in Skyros, but rather conquered the island as part of the Trojan War. Now, the Achaean forces first gathered at Aulis. All the suitors sent their forces except King Simrias of Cyprus. Now, though he sent breastplates to Agamemnon and promised to send 50 ships, he sent only one real ship led by the son of Mygdalion and 49 ships made of clay. Now Idomeneus was willing to lead the Cretan contingent in Messenia's war against Troy, but only as a co-commander. Now here's the discovery of this is the discovery of Achilles among the daughters of Lycomedes around 1664 by this is a painting by Jan de Bray. Now even though Idomeneus was only wanted to be a co-commander, which was granted, the last commander to arrive was Achilles, who was at the time 15 years old. Now, following a sacrifice to Apollo, a snake slithered from the altar to a sparrow's nest in a plane tree nearby. It ate the mother and her 9 chicks, then was turned to stone. Calchas interpreted this as a sign that Troy would fall in the 10th year of the war, which it did. Now, when the Achaeans left for the war, they did not know the way, and accidentally they landed in Mysia, which was ruled by King Telephus, son of Heracles, who had led a contingent of the Arcadians to settle there. In the battle, Achilles wounded Telephus, who had killed Thersander. Because the wound would not heal, Telephus asked an oracle what will happen to the wound, and the oracle responded that he that wounded shall heal. The Achaean fleet then set sail and was scattered by a storm, but Achilles landed in Skyros and married Deidamia. A new gathering was set again in Aulis. Now Telephus went to Aulis and either pretended to be a beggar, asking Agamemnon to help heal his wound, or he would kidnap Orestes and hold him for ransom, demanding the wound be healed. Achilles refused, claiming to have no medical knowledge, but Odysseus reasoned that the spear that had inflicted the wound must be able to heal it. Now pieces of the spear were scraped off, and the wound healed, and Telephus was healed. Now Telephus then showed the Achaeans the route to Troy. Now, some scholars have regarded the expedition against Telephus and its resolution as a derivative reworking of the elements from the main story of the Trojan War. Now, but it's also been seen as fitting the story pattern of the preliminary adventure that anticipates events and themes from the main narrative, and therefore is likely to be early and integral. 8 years after the storm had scattered, when they had all reached Aulis, the wind ceased. The prophet Calchas stated that the goddess Artemis had punished Agamemnon for killing either a sacred deer or deer in a sacred grove, and boasting that he was better a hunter than she. The only way to appease Artemis, he said, was to sacrifice Iphigenia, who was either the daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, or of Helen and Theseus, entrusted to Clytemnestra when Helen married Menelaus. Now, Agamemnon refused, and the other commanders threatened to make Palamedes commander of the expedition. Now, according to some versions, Agamemnon relented and performed the sacrifice, but others claim that he sacrificed a deer in her place, or that at the last moment, Artemis took pity on the girl and took her to be a maiden in one of her temples, substituting a lamb. The Hesiod says that Iphigenia became the goddess Hecate. The Lycaean forces are described in detail in the catalogue of ships in the second book of the Iliad. They consisted of 28 contingents from mainland Greece, the Peloponnese, the Dodecanese Islands, Crete and Ithaca, comprising 1,186 pentaconters, ships with rowers, and Thucydides says that according to tradition, there were about 1,200 ships, and that the Boeotian ships had 120 men, while Phylactus ships only had the 50 rowers, and these probably were being the maximum and minimum. These numbers would mean a total force of 70,000 to 130,000 men. Another catalog of ships is given by the Bibliotheca that offers Bibliotheca that offers somewhat but agrees in numbers. Some scholars have claimed that Homer's catalog is an original Bronze Age document, possibly the Achaean commander's orders of operations. Others believe it was a fabrication by Homer. Now, the second book of the Iliad also lists the Trojan allies, consisting of the Trojans themselves that were led by Hector, and various allies listed as Dardanians, led by Aeneas, Zalians, Adrostrians, Percotians, Pelasgians, Thracians, Syconian spearmen, the Paeonian archers, the Helizones, Mysians, and so on and so on. Nothing is said of the Trojan language. The Carians are specifically said to be barbarian speaking, and the allied contingents are said to have spoken many languages. Requiring others to be translated by their individual commanders, the Trojans and Achaeans in the Iliad share the same religion, the same culture, and the enemy heroes speak to each other in the same language, though this could be a dramatic effect. And now, this is supposed to be Philocteus and Lemnos with Heracles' bow and quiver, and this is an Attic red figure base painting. I do like those base paintings; they're kind of cool. Philocteus was Heracles' friend, and because he let Heracles' funeral appear when no one else would, he received Heracles' bow and arrows. He sailed with 7 ships full of men to the Trojan War, where he was planning on fighting for the Achaeans. They stopped either at the Christ Island for supplies, or in Tenedos, along with the rest of the fleet. Then Philocteus was bitten by a snake, and the wound festered and had a foul smell. On Odysseus' advice, the Atridae ordered Philocteus to stay on Lemnos. Now Medon took control of Philocteus' men. While landing on Tenedos, Achilles killed King Tennis, who was the son of Apollo, despite a warning by his mother that if he did so, he would be killed himself by Apollo. From Tenedos, Agamemnon sent an embassy to the Priam king of Troy, which was composed of Menelaus and Odysseus, asking for Helen to return, and the embassy refused. Philocteus stayed on Lemnos for 10 years, which was a deserted island, according to Sophocles' tragedy, Philocteus, but according to an earlier tradition that was populated by the Minyans. Now, Calchas had prophesied that the first Achaean to walk on land after stepping off a ship would be the first to die. Thus, even the leading Greeks hesitated to land. Finally, Protesilaus, who was the leader of the Phylicians, landed first. Now, Odysseus had tricked him and thrown his own shield down to land on, so that way he was the first to leap off a ship. He was not the first to land on Trojan soil. Hector killed Protesilaus in single combat, although the Trojans conceded the beach. In the second wave of attacks, Achilles killed Sincus, son of Poseidon. The Trojans then fled to the safety of the walls of their city. Now, the walls served as a sturdy fortification for defense against the Greeks, but the build of the walls were so impressive that legend held that they had been built by Poseidon and Apollo during a year of forced service to the Trojan king Laomedon. Now, Protosaurus had killed many children, but was killed by Hector in most versions of the story, although others list Aeneas, Achates, or Epibrus as a slayer. Now the Achaeans buried him as a god on the Thracian peninsula across the Troad. After Protolus' death, his brother Podarces took command of the troops. Now this is Achilles surrendering Briseis to Agamemnon from the house of the tragic poet in Pompeii. Pompeii was the city that was destroyed by a volcano back years ago. That's a big story too, if you're ever into that stuff too. Now the Achaeans besieged Troy for 9 years. This part of the war was the least developed among surviving sources. Now, which prefer to talk about events in the last year of the war. After the initial landing, the army was gathered in its entirety, again only in the 10th year. Thucydides deduces that this was due to the lack of money. They raided the Trojan allies and spent time farming the Thracian peninsula. Now, Troy was never completely besieged, but thus it maintained communications with the interior of Asia Minor. Reinforcements continued to come until the very end. The Achaeans controlled only the entrance to the Dardanelles, and Troy and her allies controlled the shortest point of Abydos and Sestos and communicated with allies in Europe. Now, Achilles and Ajax were the most active of the Achaeans, leading separate armies to raid lands of Trojan allies. According to Homer, Achilles conquered 11 cities and 12 islands. According to Apollodorus, he raided the land of Aeneas in the Troad region and stole his cattle. He also captured Lyrnessus, Pedasus, and many of the neighboring cities and killed Troilus. It was said that if he reached 20 years of age, Troy would not fall, according to Apollodorus. He also took Lesbos and Phocea, the Colophon and Smyrna, Clazomene and Cyme, and afterwards Aegialus and Tenos, the so-called 100 cities. Then in order, Adramyttium and Side, and then Endium and Linium and Cologne. He took also Hypoplasian Thebes and Lyrnessus and further Antindrus and many other cities. Now, Cacretus comments that the list is wrong, that it extends too far into the south, but other sources talk of Achilles taking Pedasus, Monia, and Lesbos with the help of Pisidice. Among the loots from these cities were Briseis from Lyrnessus, who was awarded to Achilles, and Crasius from Hypopalacian Thebes, who was awarded to Agamemnon. Now Achilles captured Lycaon, son of Priam, while he was cutting branches in his father's orchards. And Patroclus sold him as a slave in Lemos, where he was brought by the Eetion of Imbros and brought back to Troy. 12 days later, after Achilles slew him, after the death of Patroclus. Now Ajax, son of Telamon, laid waste the Thracian peninsula, of which Polymestor, who was the son-in-law of Priam, was king. Polymestor surrendered Polydorus, one of Priam's children, of whom he had custody. He then attacked the town of the king Teleutas, killed him in single combat, and carried off his daughter Tecmessa. Now Ajax also hunted the Trojan flocks both on Mount Ida and in the countryside. Numerous paintings on pottery have suggested a tale not mentioned in the literary traditions, but at some point in the war, Achilles and Ajax were playing a board game, called Petia, and they were absorbed in the game and oblivious to the surrounding battle. The Trojans had attacked and reached the heroes, who were only saved by an intervention of Athena. And here's the painting that they're talking about. This is Achilles and Ajax engaged in the game, and this vase painting is held in the Vatican Museum, which I did not know that Vatican had its own museum. Now Odysseus was sent to Thrace to return with grain, but came back empty-handed. When scorned by Palamedes, Odysseus challenged him to do better. Palamedes set out and returned with a shipload of grain. Odysseus had never forgiven Palamedes for threatening the life of his son, but in revenge, Odysseus conceived a plot where an incriminating letter was forged from Priam to Palamedes, and gold was planted in Palamedes' head and quarters. Excuse me. The letter and gold were discovered, and Agamemnon had Palamedes stoned to death for treason. However, the Pausanians, quoting the Cypria, had said that Odysseus and Diomedes drowned Palamedes while he was fishing, and Dictys says that Odysseus and Diomedes had lured Palamedes into a well, which they said contained gold, and then stoned him to death. Now Palamedes' father, Nauplius, sailed to the Troad and asked for justice, but was refused in revenge. Nauplius had traveled among the Achaean kingdoms and told the wives of the kings that they were bringing Trojan concubines to dethrone them. Now many of the Greek wives were persuaded to betray their husbands, most significantly Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, who was seduced by Agethesus, son of Thyestes. Now nearly ended the 9th year since the landing of the Achaean army, tired from the many years of fighting and from the lack of supplies, mutinied against their leaders and demanded to return to their homes. According to the Cypria, Achilles forced the army to stay. According to Apollodorus, Agamemnon brought the wine growers, daughters of Aeneas, son of Apollo, who had the gift of producing wine by touch, wheat and oil from the earth, in order to relieve the supply problem that the army was having. Now Chrysis, who was a priest of Apollo and father of the Chryseis, came to Agamemnon to ask for the return of his daughter. Agamemnon refused and insulted Chrysis, who prayed to Apollo to avenge his ill treatment. Now, enraged, Apollo afflicted the Achaean army with plague. Agamemnon was forced to return Chryseis to end the plague, and he took Achilles' concubine Briseis as his own. Enraged at the dishonor Agamemnon had inflicted upon him, Achilles decided he would no longer fight. He asked his mother Thetis to intercede with Zeus, who agreed to give the Trojans success in the absence of Achilles, but who was the best warrior of the Achaeans. Now, after the withdrawal of Achilles, the Achaeans were initially successful. Now, both armies gathered in full for the first time since the landing, but Menelaus and Paris fought a duel, which ended when Aphrodite snatched the beaten Paris from the field. With the truce broken, the armies began fighting again, but Diomedes won great renown amongst the Achaeans, killing the Trojan hero Panodorus, and nearly killing Aeneas, who was only saved by his mother Aphrodite. With the assistance of Athena, Diomedes then took the gods Aphrodite and the god of war Eris. During the next days, however, the Trojans drove the Achaeans back to their camp and were stopped at the Achaean wall by Poseidon. The next day, though, with Zeus's help, the Trojans broke into the Achaean camp and were on the verge of setting fire to the Achaean ships. But an earlier appeal to Achilles to return was rejected. After Hector burned Protesilaus' ship, he allowed his companion Patroclus to go into battle wearing Achilles' armor and lead the army. Patroclus drove the Trojans all the way back into the walls of Troy and was only prevented from storming the city of the intervention of Apollo. But Patroclus was then killed by Hector, who took Achilles' armor from the body of Patroclus because Hector thought that Patroclus was Achilles, and that's why he killed him. I'm thinking that it was Achilles. Now Achilles, maddened with grief over the death of his cousin Patroclus, swore to kill Hector in revenge. The exact nature of Achilles' relationship to Patroclus is the subject of sworn debate. Although they were certainly very close, Achilles and Patroclus are never explicitly cast as lovers by Homer, but they were depicted as such in the archaic and classical periods of Greek literature, particularly in the works of Aeschylus and Plato. He was reconciled with Agamemnon and received Briseis back untouched by Agamemnon. He received a new set of arms forged by the god Hephaestus, and he returned to the battlefield. He slaughtered many children and nearly killed Aeneas, who was saved by Poseidon. Achilles fought with the river god Scamander, and battle of the gods followed. The Trojan army had returned to the city except for Hector, who remained outside the walls because he was tricked by Athena. Achilles would end up killing Hector, and afterwards he dragged Hector's body from his chariot and refused to return the body to the Trojans for burial, but the body nevertheless remained unscathed as it was preserved from injury by Apollo and Aphrodite. The Achaeans then conducted funeral games for Patroclus. Afterwards, Priam came to Achilles' tent, guided by Hermes, and asked Achilles to return Hector's body. The armies made a temporary truce to allow the burial of the dead, and the Iliad ends with the funeral of Hector. Now here, we're going to go up, and you're going to see the triumphant Achilles dragging Hector's body around Troy from a panoramic fresco of the Achillean. Down here, you got a base painting of Achilles killing the Amazon Penthesilea, whatever. I'm not sure if I say that name right. Now, shortly after the burial of Hector, Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, arrived with her warriors. Penthesilea, daughter of Orchera and Ares, had accidentally killed her sister Hippolyte. She was purified from this action by Priam, and in exchange, she fought for him and killed many, including Machaon. According to the Placinians, Machaon was killed by Eurypylus. And according to one version, Achilles himself, who was resurrected at the request of Thetis, and another version, Penthesilea was killed by Achilles, who would later mourn her after her death. And Thersites, a simple soldier and the ugliest Achaean, taunted Achilles over his grief, and gouged out Penthesilea's eyes. Achilles slew Thersites, and after a dispute, sailed to Lesbos, where he was purified for his murder by Odysseus after sacrificing Apollo, Artemis, and Leto. Now, while they were away, Memnon of Ethiopia, son of Tithonus and Eos, came with his host to help his step brother Priam. He did not come directly from Ethiopia, but either from Susa and Persia, conquering all the peoples in between, or from the Caucasus, leading an army of Ethiopians and Indians. Like Achilles, he wore armor made by Hephaestus. In the ensuing battle, Memnon killed Antilochus, who took one of Memnon's blows to save his father Nestor. Achilles and Memnon then fought Zeus and weighed the fate of the two heroes. The weight containing that of the Memnon sank, and he was slain by Achilles. Achilles chased the Trojans to their city, which he entered. The gods, seeing that he had killed too many of their children, decided that it was time to die. He was killed after Paris shot a poisoned arrow that was guided by Apollo. In another version, he was killed by a knife to the back or heel by Paris while marrying Polyxena, daughter of Priam, in the temple of Thumbrian Apollo, the site where he had either killed Troilus. Both versions conspicuously deny the killer any sort of valor, saying that Achilles remained undefeated on the battlefield. His bones were mingled with those of Patroclus, and funeral games were held. But like Ajax, Achilles is represented as living after his death in the island of Leuce and at the mouth of the Danube River. Here's a statue of that was carved, and it was supposed to be a statue of Achilles dying. And this is in the gardens of the Achillean. Down here is the suicide of Ajax, depicted on Greek pottery, which is on display at the Chateau Musée de Bologna-sur-Mer. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. A great battle raged around the dead Achilles. Ajax held back the Trojans while Odysseus carried the body away. When Achilles' armor was offered to the smartest warrior, the two that had saved his body came forward as competitors. Agamemnon, unwilling to undertake the invidious duty of deciding between the two competitors, referred the dispute to the decision of the Trojan prisoners, inquiring of them of which of the two heroes had done most harm to the Trojans. Alternatively, the Trojans and the Pallas Athena were the judges, and following Nestor's advice, spies were sent to the walls to overhear what was said. A girl said that Ajax was the bravest of the warriors. According to Pindar, the decision was made by secret ballot among the Achaeans. In all story versions, the arms were awarded to Odysseus, driven mad with grief. Ajax desired to kill his comrades, but Athena caused him to mistake for the Achaean warriors the cattle and the herdsmen. In this frenzy, he scourged two rams, believing them to be the Agamemnon and the Menelaus. In the morning, he came to his senses and killed himself by jumping on the sword that had been given to him by Hector so that it pierced his armpit, his only vulnerable part. According to an older tradition, he was killed by the Trojans who, seeing that he was invulnerable, attacked him with clay until he was covered by it and could no longer move, thus causing him to die of starvation. This is a fresco painting depicting Odysseus, Diomedes, and Cassandra from Pompeii, Italy. You can see that right there. Now, after the 10th year, it was prophesied that Troy could not fall without Hercules' blow, which was with Philoctetes and Lemnos. Odysseus and Diomedes retrieved Philoctetes, whose wound had healed, and then was shot and killed Paris. According to Apollodorus, not much, CM. We're all good here. We're talking about the Trojan War, which is pretty interesting. I love my Greek mythology stories, and there's a lot of it. According to Apollodorus, Paris's brothers, Helenus and Deiphobus, vied over the hand of Helen. Now, Deiphobus prevailed, and Helenus abandoned Troy for Mount Ida. Calchas had said that Helenus knew the prophecies concerning the fall of Troy, so Odysseus waylaid Helenus. No. What live sex show? Now, Helenus told the Achaeans that they would win if they retrieved Pelops' bones, and persuaded Achilles' son Neoptolemus to fight for them, and then stole the Trojan Palladium. Now, the Greeks retrieved Pelops' bones and sent Odysseus to retrieve Neoptolemus, who was hiding from the warring king Lycomedes' court in Skyros. Odysseus gave him his father's arms, Eurypylus, son of Telephus, leading, according to Homer, a large force of them. No, I never went. I didn't have the money to go. Eurypylus, son of Telephus, leading, according to Homer, a large force of the Kittioi, or Hittites, or the Mysians, according to Apollodorus, and they arrived to aid the Trojans. Eurypylus killed Machaon and Peneleos, but was slain by Neoptolemus. Disguised as a beggar, Odysseus went to spy inside Troy, but was recognized by Helen. Homesick, Helen plotted with Odysseus. Later, with Helen's help, Odysseus and Diomedes stole the Palladium. Now, the end of the war came with one final plan. Now, Odysseus devised a new ruse, a giant hollow wooden horse that was sacred to the Trojans. It was built by Appius and guided by Athena. from the wood of a cornel tree grove sacred to Apollo, with the inscription, "The Greeks dedicated this thank offering to Athena for the return home." Now the hollow horse was filled with soldiers, led by Odysseus. Now the rest of the army burned the camp and sailed for Tenedos. Now when the Trojans discovered that the Greeks were gone, believing the war was over, they joyfully dragged the horse inside the city. While they debated what to do with it, some thought they ought to hurl it down from the rocks, others thought that they should burn it, while others said that they ought to dedicate it to Athena. Now both Cassandra and Laocoon warned against keeping the horse, while Cassandra had been given the gift of prophecy by Apollo. She was also cursed by Apollo, never to be believed. Serpents then came out of the sea and devoured either Laocoon and one of his two sons, Laocoon and both his sons, or his only sons, a portent which is so alarmed that the followers of Aeneas that they withdrew to Ida. The Trojans decided to keep the horse and turned to a night of mad revelry and celebration. Now Sinon and Achaean spies signaled the fleet stationed at Tenedos when it was midnight and the clear moon was rising, and the soldiers from inside the horse emerged and killed the guards. Here's a base painting of Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, kills King Priam. I didn't remember Achilles ever having a kid. Damn. Okay. Now the Achaeans entered the city and killed the sleeping population. A great massacre followed, which continued into the next day. Blood ran in torrents. Drenched was all the earth as Trojans and their alien helpers died. Here were men lying cold by bitter death all up and down the city in their blood. Now, the Trojans, filled with desperation, fought back fiercely despite being disorganized and leaderless. Now, with the fighting at its height, some donned fallen enemies attire and launched surprise counterattacks in the chaotic street, fighting over other defenders hurled down roof tiles and anything else heavy down on the ramping attackers. The outlook was grim, though, and eventually the remaining defenders were destroyed along with the whole city. Neoptolemus killed Priam, who had taken refuge at the altar of Zeus on the courtyard. Now Menelaus had killed Deiphobus, Helen's husband, after Paris' death, and also intended to kill Helen, but overcome by her beauty, he threw down his sword and took her to the ships. Now this is Menelaus capturing Helen in Troy. Ajax the Lesser drags Cassandra from Palladium before the eyes of Priam. And this is a fresco painting at Pompeii. Now, Ajax the Lesser would rape Cassandra on Athena's altar while she was clinging to her statue, and because of Ajax's impiety, the Achaeans, urged by Odysseus, wanted to stone him to death, but he fled to Athena's altar and was spared. Antenor, who had given hospitality to Menelaus and Odysseus when they asked for the return of Helen, and who had advocated so, was spared along with his family. Aeneas took his father on his back and fled, and according to Apollodorus, was allowed to go because of his piety. Now, the Greeks then burned the city and divided the spoils, basically. Cassandra was awarded to Agamemnon. Neoptolemus got Andromache, wife of Hector, and Odysseus was given Hecuba, Priam's wife. The Achaeans threw Hector's infant son Astyanax down from the walls of Troy, either out of cruelty and hate or to end the royal line, and thus the possibility of his son getting revenge. And they, by usual tradition, Neoptolemus also sacrificed the Trojan prince Polyxena on the grave of Achilles. Athrea, Theseus' mother and one of Helen's handmaids, was rescued by her grandsons Demophan and Acamas. Now the return. Now the gods were very angry over the destruction of their temples and other sacrilegious acts by the Achaeans, and described that most would not return home. A storm fell on the returning fleet of Tenos Island. Nauplius, in revenge for the murder of his son Palamedes, set up false lights in Cape Caphaerus, also known today as Cabo Duro, and Euboea, and many were shipwrecked. Now here's Poseidon. Here's a picture of Poseidon smiting Ajax the Lesser. Agamemnon had made it back to Argos safely with Cassandra in his possession after some stormy weather. He and Cassandra were slain by Aegisthus in the oldest versions of the story, or by Clytemnestra, or by both of them. Electra and Orestes later avenged their father, but Orestes was the one who was chased by the Furies. Now Nestor, who had the best conduct of Troy, did not take part in the looting, but was the only hero who had a fast and safe return. And those of his army that survived the war also reached home with him safely, but later felt and colonized Metapontium in southern Italy. Now Ajax the Lesser, who had endured more than the others with the wrath of the gods, never returned home. His ship was wrecked by a storm sent by Athena, who borrowed one of Zeus's thunderbolts and tore the ships to pieces. The crew managed to land in a rock, but Poseidon struck it, and Ajax fell in the sea and drowned, and he was buried by Thetis and Mykonos or Delos. Now Teucer, son of Telamon and half-brother of Ajax, stood trial by his father for his half-brother's death. He was disowned by his father and was not allowed back on Salamis Island. And he was set at sea in Piraeus. He was acquitted of responsibility but found guilty of negligence because he did not return his dead body or his arms. He left with his army, who took their wives and founded Salamis in Cyprus. And then so on and so on. Now, according to the Odyssey, Menelaus' fleet was blown by storms to Crete and Egypt, where they were unable to sail away because of the winds being calm. Only five of his ships survived. Menelaus had to catch Proteus, a shape-shifting sea god, to find out what sacrifices to which gods he would have to make to guarantee his safe passage home. Now, according to some stories, the Helen who was taken by Paris was a fake, and the real Helen was in Egypt, where she was reunited with Menelaus. Now, Proteus also told Menelaus that he was destined to Elysium, heaven, after his death. Now, Menelaus, not much. Menelaus returned to Sparta with Helen 8 years later after he left Troy. Now, Agamemnon returned home with Cassandra to Argos. His wife Clytemnestra, which was Helen's sister, was having an affair with Aegisthus, son of Thyestes. Now, Agamemnon's cousin, who had conquered Argos before Agamemnon himself retook it, possibly out of vengeance for the death of Iphigenia, Clytemnestra plotted with her lover to kill either at a fest or in his bath. According to different versions, Cassandra was also killed. Agamemnon's son Orestes, who had been away, returned and conspired with his sister Electra to avenge their father. He killed Clytemnestra. Yeah, I don't know about Celibate Island. I don't know if there's anything called that. Now Odysseus' 10-year journey home to Ithaca was told in Homer's Odyssey. Now, Odysseus and his men were blown far off course to lands unknown to the Achaeans, and there Odysseus had many adventures, including the famous encounter with the Cyclops Polyphemus. In an audience with the seer Tiresias and Hades. On the island of Thrinacia, Odysseus' men ate the cattle sacred to the sun god Helios. Now, for this sacrilege, Odysseus' ships were destroyed, and all his men perished. Odysseus had not eaten the cattle and was allowed to live, but he washed ashore on the island of Aegea, and he lived there with the nymph Calypso. After 7 years, the gods decided to send Odysseus home on a small raft, and he sailed to Scheria, the home of the Phoenicians, who gave him passage to Ithaca. Once in his homeland, Odysseus traveled disguised as an old beggar, and he was recognized by his dog Argos, who died in his lap. He then discovered that his wife Penelope had been faithful to him during the 20 years he was absent, despite the countless suitors that were eating his food and spending his property. With the help of his son Telemachus, Athena and and Eumaeus, the swineherd. He killed all of them except Medon, who had been polite to Penelope, and Phemius, who was a local. Um, no, he killed all of them except Medon, who had been polite to Penelope, and Phemius, who was a local singer, who had only been forced to help the suitors against Penelope. Penelope tested Odysseus with his unstrung recurve bow to ensure that it was him, and he forgave her. The next day, the suitors' relatives tried to take revenge on him, but they were stopped by Athena. Um, the Telegony picks up where the Odyssey leaves off, beginning with the burial of the dead suitors, and continues until the death of Odysseus. Now, some years later, after Odysseus' return, Telegonus, the son of Odysseus and Circe, came to Ithaca and plundered the island. Odysseus, attempting to fight off the attack, was killed by his unrecognized son. After Telegonus realized that he had killed his own father, he brought the body to his mother Circe along with Telemachus and Penelope. Circe made them immortal. Then Telegonus married Penelope, and Telemachus married Circe. Um, Now the journey of the Trojan survivor Aeneas and his unsettling and his resettling of the Trojan refugees in Italy were the subject of the Latin epic poem The Aeneid by Virgil. Um, writing during the time of Augustus, Virgil has his hero give a first-person account of the fall of Troy in the second book of the Aeneid's 12 books. The Trojan horse, which does not appear in the Iliad, became legendary from Virgil's account. Now Aeneas leads a group of survivors away from the city, among them his son Ascanius, also known as Lullus. Um, his trumpeter Anessus, father Anchius, the healer Lapix, his faithful sidekick Ecatus, and Mimus as a guide. His wife Creusa is killed during the sack of the city. Now, the Aeneas also carries the Lyris and the Penates of Troy, which the historical Romans claimed to preserve as guarantees of Romans' own security. Now, the Trojan survivors escape with a number of ships, seeking to establish a new homeland elsewhere. They land in several nearby countries that prove inhospitable, and are finally told by an oracle that they must return to the land of their forebears. Now, they first tried to establish themselves in Crete, where Dardanus had once settled, but they find it ravaged by the same plague that had driven Idomeneus away. They find the colony led by Helenus and Andromache, but decline to remain. After 7 years, they arrive in Carthage, where Aeneas had an affair with the queen Dido, since, according to tradition, Carthage was founded in 814 BC, but the arrival of the Trojan refugees a few hundred years earlier exposes chronological difficulties with the mythic tradition. But eventually, the gods order Aeneas to continue onward, and he and his people arrive at the mouth of the Tiber River in Italy. Dido commits suicide, and Aeneas' betrayal of her was regarded as an element in the long enmity between Rome and Carthage that expressed itself in the Punic Wars and led to Roman hegemony. At Cumae, the symbol leads Aeneas and an archetypal descent to the underworld. Now, where the shade of his dead father serves as a guide, but this book of the Aeneid directly influenced Dante, who was Virgil's act as his narrator's guide. Now, there's dates of the Trojan War. Since this war was considered among the ancient Greeks as either the last event of the mythical age or the first event of the historical age, several dates are given for the fall of Troy. They usually derive from the genealogies of King Ephorus. Between the year, different years were given. So 1135 was given by Ephorus. Sosebus gives 1172. Eratosthenes 1184 or 1183 BC. Timaeus 1193 BC. The Parian Marble 1209. Dicarchus 1212. Herodotus around 1250 BC, Aretus 1291, and Dorius gives the year 1334 BC. As for the exact date, um, nobody really knows when it fell. But the glorious and rich city Homer, the glorious and rich city Homer describes, was believed to be Troy the Sixth by many 12th century AD authors, and destroyed, and they believe it was destroyed around about 1275 BC, probably by an earthquake. But its successor Troy was destroyed around 1180 BC. It was long considered a poorer city and dismissed as a candidate for Homeric Troy, but since the excavation campaign of 1988, it has become to be regarded as the most likely candidate. The historicity of the Trojan War, including whether it occurred at all and where Troy was located, if it ever existed, is still subject to debate. Most classical Greeks throughout that war thought that it was a historical event. Many believed that the Homeric poems had exaggerated the event to suit the demands of poetry. For instance, the historian Thucydides, who was known for being critical, considers it to be a true event, but doubts that 1,186 ships were sent to Troy. Euripides started changing the Greek myths at will, including those of the Trojan War. Near 180, Chrysostom argued that while the war was historical, it ended with the Trojans winning and the Greeks attempting to hide the fact. Around 1870, it was generally agreed in Western Europe that the Trojan War had never happened and Troy never existed. But then Heinrich Schliemann popularized his excavation of Turkey, which he believed to be Troy and of the Messenian cities of Greece. Today, many scholars agree that the Trojan War is based on the historical core of a Greek expedition against the city of Troy, but few would argue that the Homeric poems favorably represent the actual events of the war. In November of 2001, let's see when this Heinrich Schliemann guy ever lived. 1890. Damn, that's when he died. Okay. Okay, so at least we know. Okay. Now back in November of 2001, geologist John C. Kraft and classical John B. Luce presented the results of investigations into the geology of the region that started in 1977. The geologists compared the present geology with the landscapes and coastal features described in the Iliad and other classical sources, notably Strabo's Geographica. Their conclusion was that there was regularly a consistency between the location of Troy as identified by Schliemann and other locations such as the Greek camp. The geological evidence and descriptions of the topography and accounts of the battle in the Iliad, although of course this could be a coincidence. Since the 12th century, here's Schliemann's picture. Up the top here, this is Heinrich Schliemann. Down here is the walls of the late Bronze Age Troy. Now, since the 12th century, scholars have attempted to draw conclusions based on Hittite and Egyptian texts that date to the time of the Trojan War. And while they give a general description of the political situation in the region at the time, their information on whether the particular conflict took place is limited. Andrew Dolby notes that while the Trojan War most likely did take place in some form and is therefore grounded in history, its true nature is unknown. Now, the Tawa-Galawa letter mentions a kingdom of Achaia or Greece that lies beyond the sea, that would be the Aegean, and controls Melawanda, which is identified with Miletus. Now, also mentioned in this and other letters in the Siwa Confederation, made of 22 cities and countries, which included the city of Wilusa. The Milawata letter implies this city lies in the north of the Siwa Confederation beyond the Siha River. While the identification of Wilusa with Ilium, which is said to be Troy, is always controversial. In the 1990s, it gained majority acceptance and the Alexandru Treaty of 1280 BC. The king of the city is named Alexandro, and Paris's name in the Iliad, among other works, is Alexander. The Tawagalawan letter, dated back to around 1250 BC, which is addressed to the king of Ahabwaya, exactly says, "Now as we have reached agreement on the matter of Walusa, over which we went to war." Now, formerly under the Hittites, the Suwa Confederation defeated after the Battle of Kadesh between Egypt and the Hittites around 1274 BC. And that's really about the end of it. So you get the idea. So if you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Rusty the King. And also make sure to hit that like and subscribe button for more videos like this. The other videos I could possibly do next week. I'll give you the names of the videos and tell me which one you want me to do a video on. You got the werewolf, Blood the Impaler, the Sacred Bull, Joan of Arc, or St. Patrick for next week. Let me know in the video which one you want me to do a video on, and I'll get to it next week. So that's about all for today. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll be back next week.